Monster Hunter Tri released in 2009 for the Nintendo Wii. This game introduced a brand new mechanic to the series, underwater combat. For the first time ever, players could dive down and explore the ocean and fight the monsters that live there. In traditional Monster Hunter gameplay, we run around on relatively flat ground, striking, dodging, and weaving through various monster attacks. Later games in the series have hunters briefly take to the skies as part of special attacks, but the combat is still largely on the ground. Underwater combat, however, had players move around in a complete 360-degree environment. We don't just move left, right, forwards and backwards, but also up and down, and this opens up the combat massively. It was present as a gameplay mechanic in Monster Hunter Tri, absent from Portable 3rd, and back in 3 Ultimate. That was its last appearance, and it has not returned since then. In this video, we shall discuss underwater combat in pretty much its entirety, its history, how it functioned, the monsters that fought there, the positives, the drawbacks, and whether or not it should return to Monster Hunter. This video is technically a follow-up to another video I made on Lagiacrus, and while it's not necessary to watch, I do recommend it as I discuss certain aspects of underwater combat there. Monster Hunter Tri begins in Moga Village, a small fishing settlement attached to an island in the middle of the ocean, with larger islands surrounding it. One of these islands is the Deserted Island, the very first hunting locale in the game. The island features rivers, dark caves, a huge mountain, and 2 underwater regions you can explore. There are 5 total hunting locales in Tri. The Deserted Island is one of them, but we also have the sandy plains, the flooded forest, the tundra, and the volcano. Out of all of these, the flooded forest is the only other locale to have underwater zones. Some of you may be familiar with this map in Monster Hunter Rise, and in terms of general layout it hasn't changed much. The main difference in Tri is that half the zones featured underwater sections, a huge contrast with the Deserted Island only having 2 underwater zones out of 12. When moving around underwater, you are in a completely 3D space. You can swim in all directions, and this is done by moving the camera around. You will move in the direction it is facing and direct your attacks in that direction. You can dodge around, and dodging after an attack while holding up or down on the analog stick will allow you to move in those directions very quickly. You can't Superman dive at all. Your time underwater is limited by an oxygen bar that slowly depletes over time. If it runs out, your health starts rapidly depleting. This is pretty hard to do though, because restoring it is as easy as resurfacing, finding bubbles underground, or even consuming certain items. In most Monster Hunter games, you have feline palicos as your companions, who help you out on hunts. But Tri instead has shakalaka companions, which are small creatures from the 2nd generation. This is because cats generally hate water, so you're instead accompanied by a shakalaka named Cha-Cha, who is capable of swimming underwater and aiding you in various ways. Now, in terms of combat, each weapon has access to an underwater moveset, which ends up being almost a 1-to-1 version of the land moveset. The attacks are generally just a lot slower, but hits at wider angles. Let's look at the hammer for instance. It has access to its triple swing, its charge attacks, its side smash, pretty much all its regular moves. The sword and shield has access to its run and slash, its various combos, the shield bash, the spin attack, as well as the ability to block. Now it's worth mentioning that all the underwater attacks have been animated from scratch, since they couldn't just copy and paste the land animations. This took a lot of work to implement and perhaps came at a cost. The only weapons available in this game are the greatsword, sword and shield, hammer, lance, longsword, and a newly introduced switch axe. The gun lance, hunting horn, dual swords and bow did not return from Freedom Unite and are therefore completely absent. The heavy and light bowguns are also technically reworked into the standard bowgun, which can be made heavy, medium or light depending on what customizations you add. This means that Tri has 7 weapons, down from the 12 in Freedom Unite. To this day, it is a fairly big criticism of the game. The reason given was, after a great deal of debate, we concluded that we needed to whittle down the weapon categories and concentrate on adding more depth to each individual weapon. So make of that what you will. Now, let's talk about the monsters in this game, particularly the ones capable of underwater combat. You have Lagiacrus, the flagship of this game, a leviathan capable of unleashing thunder attacks while underwater. The Royal Ludroth, a beginner monster, a leviathan with a spongy mane with lots of physical and water-based attacks. We have the Gobul, a leviathan resembling an anglerfish, capable of ambushing you from below and stunning you with his lamp, encountered after Ludroth but before Lagiacrus. And finally Sadius, the final village boss for the game, an elder dragon responsible for almost sinking Moga village. He's huge with 2 large horns and some very hard hitting attacks, both physical and water element. He's only available to fight in single player low rank. Monster Hunter Tri has 18 total monsters, and out of all of them, only 4 are capable of fighting underwater. If we remember the game's locales, 2 out of 5 feature underwater regions, and even then, the flooded forest is only half underwater, and the deserted island has 2 out of 12 areas. Moga Village is based on the water. The game's flagship is a water monster. It's all over the game cover and featured in the introduction cutscene. Even the monster encounter music evokes the deep sea. Yet despite all this, it would seem that underwater combat, despite being one of the biggest additions to this game and pretty central to its identity, isn't really that big of a feature here. The vast majority of these monsters are land only, fighting on solid ground. The next game in the series was Monster Hunter Portable 3rd. This game was significantly bigger than Tri in a lot of ways. It had an extra map, many more monsters, and subspecies of existing ones, as well as weapon types cut from Tri. The big difference was that underwater combat was completely absent for this entry. The deserted island lost areas 11 and 12, with the structure of area 10 being altered. The flooded forest underwater zones were redesigned to be land-based, and now appeared dried up. The flooded forest you see in Monster Hunter Rise is largely based on the Portable 3rd version. Out of the 4 underwater monsters in Tri, only 1 returned to Portable 3rd, and that was the Royal Ludroth. The others, Sadius, Lagiacrus and Gobul, were all left behind. The reason for this was that at their cores, they were mostly designed to be underwater fights, or entirely in Sadius' case, as he fights exclusively underwater. Gobul on land is a bit of a joke, and Lagiacrus generally only goes on land when exhausted and fights almost the exact same as Royal Ludroth, so including only him makes sense. Cha-Cha is also not in this game, and is replaced by the Palicos. The 3 underwater monsters were not necessarily replaced, but Portable 3rd introduced new monsters with similarities to them. Its flagship monster, Zinogre, being a fanged beast capable of charging himself up over time, was something of a stand-in to Lagiacrus. There was Nibblesnuff, a leviathan who swims in the sand and has a similar body structure to Gobul, and Amatsu, the final hub boss, a large elder dragon who floats in the air and uses water elements similar to Sadius. The result of this is that Portable 3rd ends up being quite a meaty game that feels similar to the other entries in the series. It has a decent cast of monsters, great combat with the weapon rework seen in Monster Hunter Tri, as well as new reworks for the restored weapons. It has a hefty amount of content, and for the PSP it has remarkably good graphics. In addition to all this, the game sold quite a lot, roughly 5 million copies. This means that for a long time it was the best selling Monster Hunter game, and this is all while being Japan exclusive. Despite all this though, Portable 3rd did not get a G-Rank expansion like Freedom 2. Instead, Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate was more of an expansion to Tri. 3 Ultimate released for the 3DS and later the Wii U. On paper, the way to describe this game would be Monster Hunter Tri with G-Rank and Portable 3rd content mixed in. It has the underwater maps in Tri, Moga Village as opposed to Portable 3rd's Yukomo, and the storyline, flagship monster, and final village boss scene in Tri. The difference is that they sprinkle Portable 3rd monsters in throughout the main story, and they do a pretty good job of it. They feel like they were always meant to be a part of the game to begin with, and some have also fought in high rank. The Misty Peaks from Portable 3rd is also included and encountered there. A new Shakalaka is also present for the main story, known as Kayamba, meaning that you can have up to 2 companions with you. I said earlier, underwater combat is back. The returning weapons now have underwater movesets just like the ones in Tri. With the new target camera feature, aiming with camera underwater can now be a bit easier than before. What's interesting here is that there wasn't really anything new added to this mechanic. There are 0 new underwater hunting locales, and the Misty Peaks wasn't updated to have any underwater areas. The deserted island and flooded forest were restored to their former appearances, but are otherwise unchanged. Movement wise, we get nothing new either. In terms of monsters, the new additions are the Ivory Lagiacrus, a subspecies of Lagiacrus that fights mostly on land but is capable of going underwater. Abyssal Lagiacrus, a rare species of Lagiacrus that fights entirely underwater. Goldbeard Sadius, a subspecies of Sadius that skips the first phase of the fight and can be fought in multiplayer. Diameralis, the final boss of the hub, an elder dragon related to Fatalis capable of going on land or under the sea. And finally Plesioth and his subspecies Green Plesioth. Plesioth is a Piscean wyvern from the very first game, and he is iconic for being difficult but fair. In the older games he would be fought on land, but would often retreat into the sea, where you would have to wait for him to come out while he would take annoying pot shots at you. In 3 Ultimate, you can now chase him into the water and fight him there. Definitely a cool addition, and the developers knew it, seeing as he's even featured on the disc and the back of the box. Those are all of the underwater monsters introduced in 3 Ultimate. You might notice that it's mostly just subspecies, and the only 2 new additions are Plesioth and Diameralis. This isn't new for Monster Hunter. Most expansions feature subspecies and returning monsters, with very few truly new additions. But even in 3 Ultimate, Plesioth is a returning monster from an older game, and Diameralis barely counts as an underwater monster. He doesn't swim, he just stands on the ocean floor, and he doesn't have any exclusive underwater attacks. The only thing underwater combat does for the fight is affect how we fight him, since it lets us access weak points higher up on his body. Monster Hunter Tri had 18 monsters, 4 of which could go underwater, so roughly 22% of its whole cast. Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate has 51 monsters, and 10 of them can go underwater, which is roughly 19% of the whole cast. That's slightly less than Tri. Now consider that in Tri, less than half the hunting locales have underwater zones, and even in those locales, half or more of the areas are land-based. 3 Ultimate didn't add any new locales with underwater zones either. As a gameplay mechanic, it wasn't as big of a part of Monster Hunter Tri as you might have come to believe, and in 3 Ultimate it was even smaller, and in future games it was gone entirely, never to return. Monster Hunter 4 released for the 3DS only, and underwater combat was not in the game. In fact, very few monsters introduced in Monster Hunter 3 and related games were present. Only Zinogre, Deviljho, Brachydios, Lagombi, the Great Jaggy and related subspecies. You might notice none of these monsters are underwater, and that's because 4 and its expansion did not feature a single Leviathan. It's also worth mentioning 4 Ultimate launched with not only all previous weapons in the series, but 2 brand new ones, as well as 52 total large monsters, just 1 more than 3 Ultimate. Underwater combat allowed for verticality in the game's combat and locations, allowing hunters to move up and down, as well as other directions. For this game, however, the developers decided to pursue verticality in a different way, focusing above the land rather than below it. The maps now feature hills and cliffs, and the hunter's mobility was increased to better traverse them. All weapons now have jump attacks that can be used to mount a monster, a new mechanic that allows you to topple them if you complete a short minigame. Generations was the next entry, and further increased verticality by bringing back mounting, as well as adding ledges to a plethora of classic maps from the series. It also featured aerial style, one of 6 hunting styles in the game. This one in particular lets you vault off monsters to perform powerful aerial attacks. World featured maps with a similar design philosophy to 4's, lots of hills and ledges, but it also added slopes which hunters can slide down. They're great for traversal, but they're also for combat, as hunters can perform jumping attacks off them. And finally, Rise added the wire bug, a grappling hook that lets us swing around, run up walls, and perform crazy aerial attacks. Now, there's a very clear trajectory here, in terms of the approach taken towards verticality. The developers attempted vertical combat one way, decided against it for whatever reason, attempted it another way, and stuck with it for every game since, reiterating and experimenting with new ideas based around jumping, climbing, and movement options above the land rather than below the sea. Now looking back, Monster Hunter 4 was in early production the same time 3 Ultimate was in development, so the developers knew that underwater combat was being shelved for future entries. This is perhaps why they didn't invest many resources into the system, aside from the returning weapon movesets, since they knew it would be wasted. We don't get any movement options, the only truly new underwater monster does not have any exclusive underwater attacks, and the attacks it does have are largely shared with Fatalis and Crimson Fatalis, both of whom appear in Monster Hunter 4, which is an example of the developers future-proofing themselves. The only other brand new monster is Brachydios, a brute wyvern who fights exclusively on land, and returns to Monster Hunter 4. Even the ivory Lagiacrus is a monster optimized for land-based combat, rarely fighting underwater. Again, it's as if they were trying to future-proof the monster, giving it a moveset to be formidable on land, and slowly moving away from the mechanic within 3 Ultimate. So that's the history of underwater combat, its introduction, its return, and its permanent removal. We've discussed how it was implemented in Monster Hunter Tri and 3 Ultimate, but we haven't discussed how it was implemented. That is to say, was it done well? What were the positives or the drawbacks? Let's get into it. So let's discuss the good parts of underwater combat. One of the positives was that it really helped expand the world of Monster Hunter. We have wyverns, monkeys, crabs, raptors. It would surely stand to reason that we have terrifying beasts in the sea too, right? In the older games we only had Plesioth, but Tri introducing underwater combat allowed for even more to exist, and 3 Ultimate allowed for Plesioth to be fought underwater. It made Monster Hunter feel much bigger, not just in terms of monsters that could exist, but also where we could go. It also allowed for some pretty cool combat potential. As said earlier, previous Monster Hunter games had us run around on flat terrain, but with underwater combat we could move around in all directions. It's true vertical combat, achieved without making us fly around with wings. And in terms of fighting, it can allow for some interesting design choices. Take the Lagiacrus. His spikes can be broken fully to disable his lightning abilities, but they're pretty hard to reach on land, as you'd have to knock him down in order to reach them. But when underwater, you can swim down and hit them from above. But Lagiacrus is much faster underwater, meaning there's extra risk in going after them, making for a great dynamic. Or how about Diamoralis? He's pretty large even by Elder Dragon standards, and his body is covered in magma boils that act as weak points. Some of them are so high that you cannot reach them except for when you're underwater, as you can swim to higher points on his body and go to town. Underwater zones could also be very atmospheric, particularly the flooded forest. The dark and murky water really made monster encounters feel extra dangerous and scary, and they really contrasted with the bright water of the cave area. Praise should also be given for the combat being a genuinely new experience. 3 Ultimate was my 4th Monster Hunter game, and fighting monsters like Lagiacrus or Ludroth underwater felt like fresh experiences, despite me having faced them in generations. Now let's discuss the bad parts of underwater combat. Monster Hunter combat often gets labelled as clunky or slow. I and many others disagree with this. It feels deliberate, weighty. You have to commit to your attacks and kind of plan ahead in order to deal damage and not get hit. I wouldn't even describe games like Freedom Unite as clunky, and while recent games like Rise feel a lot faster, they're still very deliberate compared to your standard action game. I would, however, describe underwater combat as clunky. Swimming around is slow. The attacks feel almost sluggish and aimless, and the dodging feels incredibly drawn out. It does not feel nearly as satisfying as the land combat, which is so nicely refined. The controls do not help with this. As said earlier, you have to aim the camera around to determine which direction you will swim in, which in practice is very annoying. In the older Monster Hunter games, you would manipulate the camera with the D-pad and aim it behind you with the L button. Recent games utilise a right analog stick for camera control, but target camera is still a thing, and you still spend most of the time ready to attack. In general, camera control isn't so important that you need to be moving it at all times. When underwater though, the camera plays such a huge role in where you can move that you have to be constantly manipulating it, and it feels incredibly awkward. On land, you can always dodge forwards or to the side relative to where you're facing, but when underwater, the camera direction is what determines where you'll dodge, and it can really throw you off. There will be several times where you need to maneuver around a monster and you find yourself pointing the camera away from your target just to be able to move away from them, meaning you'll have to take your eyes off the thing that's trying to kill you. A reason for this is because Monster Hunter Tri supports the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, where you attack by swinging the remote around. Because your thumb is controlling the camera at all times with the D-pad, it ends up feeling more natural, but it's still a problem for people who like the traditional controls. Now there is a setting to alleviate this. In Tri, when using a Wii Classic controller, you can set ZL or ZR to move up and down while underwater. It's not a perfect solution since now you have to keep track of more buttons, particularly when you want to aim up or down, and pressing left and right buttons to move up and down will never not feel weird, but it works fine enough. But this option was not included in 3 Ultimate, which only lets you move around with the camera. In fact, let's discuss underwater combat in 3 Ultimate. The game was initially released for the 3DS, and sold the most there. The base 3DS and XL models only have one analog stick, similar to the PSP. Unlike the PSP games, 3 Ultimate was built for a home console where the camera controls are opposite to the movement ones. The result feels really awkward. However, the game has an option to place various UI elements on the touchscreen, and this includes a virtual D-pad. This is also in Monster Hunter 4 and Generations, and while it's serviceable in those games, I don't find it adequate for underwater combat. In the 4th generation games, it's used for standard camera control, and while it is not as good as a second analog stick, it works just fine. But in 3 Ultimate, you're asking much more of it, and it's just not good enough for the job, making the controls just as, if not more awkward than in Tri. Now there is a purchasable add-on for the 3DS that adds a second circle pad, and 3 Ultimate is a supported game. There's even bundles that have it packaged in. The Wii U by default has 2 analog sticks, so that's one problem technically eliminated. But wait, there's more. Depth perception. On land, it's easy to gauge how far away the monster is from you, just by the default camera angle having the ground in view. Knowing the range of your attacks and where they'll land is a big part of Monster Hunter's deliberate, weighted combat, and some weapons even deal damage based on your distance from the monster. When underwater, however, it's really easy to undershoot everything, because there's no reference point to tell how far away you are from the monster. Not to mention that because you move forward in exactly the direction the camera is facing, you often end up level with the monster you're fighting, making it even harder to aim. This means that weapons like the sword and shield have a lot of trouble due to their shorter range, while weapons like the lance and gun lance were heavily favoured, not just because their shields let them offset manoeuvrability costs, but because their long reaches meant undershooting was a bit harder to do. Now you might be thinking, depth perception? The 3DS has the 3D effect, surely that can help. Now ignoring the fact that the Wii, Wii U and 2DS owners don't have access to this feature, the 3DS has a different related problem. Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate has a really low resolution, and in general looks pretty pixelated. This isn't much of an issue in standard fights, but when underwater it makes things really hard to see. The flooded forest being murky is awesome for atmosphere, but not very practical when you want to actually see what you're fighting. And no, the 3D effect doesn't actually help with depth perception very much, if at all. Speaking of the flooded forest, this locale may have more underwater zones, but they can be pretty cramped. When fighting in a big 3D environment, ideally you'd want a lot of space, and the 2 underwater deserted island areas do this very well. But everything is so small in the forest that fighting can be pretty hard, and it's even worse when there's multiple monsters present, or if the target is particularly large. Now think of all these issues, the horrid camera controls, the clunky combat, the problems related to each platform, the depth perception. Now imagine fighting multiple monsters in the same area. It's not a pleasant time. Another issue related to underwater combat is how it affects the pace of the fight. I noted in the History of Lagiacrus video that monsters like Gormagala, Zinogre, or even monsters like Malzeno switch between 2 movesets throughout their fight, keeping things fresh and forcing you to readapt, are technically preceded by underwater combat. A monster like Lagiacrus can fight one way and then swim underwater, forcing you to fight him another way. The difference here though is that Gormagala, Malzeno, and other related monsters will change the way they fight instantly and seamlessly. No time is wasted as the fight rapidly changes. With underwater monsters though, they awkwardly turn around and beeline towards the land or sea, sometimes traversing through a loading zone to do so. It's pretty jarring and annoying having to chase after them. Those are some of the positives and negatives of underwater combat. It was an interesting concept with great potential, but the execution was just... it needed more refinement that it never really got since it never returned for future entries. If it had been in 4, Generations, World and Rise, perhaps it really could have been something amazing. It's an interesting experience in Tri and 3 Ultimate, and there's not much else like it. With a bit of refinement, it certainly could be an amazing mechanic. It begs the ultimate question this video sets out to answer, or at least heavily discuss. Should underwater combat return to Monster Hunter? It was a cool idea with a somewhat flawed implementation, and never returned for recent games. With the Nintendo eShop for 3DS and Wii U shutting down in 2023, it will be hard for players to go back and experience those games. With modern technology, controls, and the power of hindsight, it could be a good idea to give the concept another go for the next game. This segment is largely going to be anecdotal, talking about what I have personally seen in regards to the perception of underwater combat. We've discussed the history, the positives and the negatives, but we haven't yet talked about what Monster Hunter players think about it. I posted a poll on my Twitter account that you should totally follow, asking people whether or not they wanted underwater combat back. Over 70% of people said yes. I recommend you read the replies because people left some interesting reasons. Anyway, this means that the majority of people who voted do actually want the system back, and to me this is pretty significant because years ago, I'm talking 2014, 16, 17, it was not seen favourably by a lot of the community. Monster Hunter 4 was praised for cutting what felt like a restrictive system, and instead expanding the hunter's moveset on land. I recall one review praising the implementation of Zinogre, noting that if he was in 3 Ultimate, we would have had to follow him into the water, and him sticking on land instead made for a better fight. You can find really old forum posts from around 4 and Generations releases talking about how people felt about the mechanic being gone. The comments largely expressed joy, calling it slow and bad, calling land combat superior. Many people expressed criticisms featured in this video, showing that they're not really new. People have felt this way for a very long time. They serve as a really interesting time capsule where you can see the highest voted comments clearly detested it. Not everybody hated underwater combat of course, but a huge amount of people did, or were indifferent to its removal. It was a very polarizing mechanic. And now, it would seem that a lot of people want it back. And to be honest, there are a lot of legitimate reasons as to why underwater combat should be brought back into a new Monster Hunter game. In this segment of the video, we shall discuss some of these reasons, and how they could make reviving this concept worth doing. Earlier this year, I made a video called The Forgotten Monsters of Monster Hunter, where I discussed certain monsters who had not appeared in the series for 2 generations. In this case, Gobul, Sadius, and Dire Morales are kinda forgotten, being stuck in 3 Ultimate. The thing that's holding them back is that they were reliant on underwater combat, and without it they simply couldn't work. Bringing it back would potentially allow them to return. Lagiacrus returned for generations, but it did not feel right without underwater, and perhaps he'd truly be able to shine with it. It's not just forgotten monsters that could come back however. Think about how 3 Ultimate brought back Plesioth and let us fight him underwater. The same thing could happen for other water-based monsters. Somnicanth, Almudron, Tetranodon,
Jyuratodus,
Zamtrios, Namiel, Tetsukabra, Mizutsune are all monsters that are amphibious and could be really cool underwater. It's a really good opportunity to fight monsters we kind of already know, but in a brand new way. Speaking of brand new, there's a lot of opportunities for monsters capable of underwater combat that we've never seen before. Tri and 3 Ultimate never really did anything more than leviathans underwater, even Sadius is just a giant leviathan. But there's potential for some really cool additions. New amphibians, new piscine wyverns, underwater crabs, maybe they could even add squids or octopi. Bringing underwater combat back would really expand the potential for returning and new monsters. Underwater zones also expand the world of Monster Hunter much better too. Think about 3 Ultimate, where you can fight monsters that fly in the sky, monsters that stalk the land, and monsters from the sea. Other games have them too, but 3 Ultimate has you physically dive down and fight them there. In theory, it makes for a really immersive game, and makes the world feel a lot bigger than before. Then we have the Charged Blade and Insect Glaive from 4 Ultimate. Those weapons were introduced later, and thus never received underwater movesets. If the mechanic was brought back, then we could get to use those weapons underwater, which could be really interesting. Speaking of bringing in elements from newer games, there are some people who argue that the mobility issues could easily be solved by bringing in tools like the Clutch Claw or the Wire Bug. If hunters are struggling to close the distance between them and a monster while underwater, perhaps in a newer game they could sling themselves across with a Water Bug or an actually good iteration of the Clutch Claw. It could be worth bringing back for those improvements. So those are some arguments as to why underwater combat should return to Monster Hunter. At least, these are the ones I've seen and thought of myself over the years. I've thought about the prospect a lot recently, weighing up the positives and the potential drawbacks. I ultimately came to this conclusion. I do not want underwater combat to return. Not only this, I think bringing it back is a bad idea. it would be a complete waste of time and resources, and in this segment of the video I shall explain why. I want you all to think for a moment about how much work it took to implement underwater combat. They had to code in a way for hunters and monsters to move around in a 3D space with an additional axis. They had to animate the swimming, the faster swimming, the item consumption, the dodging, the getting hit, the dodging with a weapon. Every single individual weapon attack all had to be animated from scratch for underwater combat. That's not even mentioning the monsters, where they had to design the movement and underwater attacks for each Leviathan and how they functioned underwater and on land. All this for a mechanic that exists in 2 of the game's total locales and only 7 out of 22 total areas across them. Now I want you to think about every single unique mechanic in future games and the amount of work they took. 4 Ultimate's Verticality required them to redesign how hunters approach ledges and walls, with new climbing animations. When adding mounting to the game, they had to add at least 1 jumping attack for every weapon, a unique stabbing and gripping animation for the hunter, at least 20 special flailing animations for each monster type respectively, as well as a special taunt animation for if the hunter gets thrown off. This is a lot of work too, but there are some key differences compared to the work put in for underwater. 4 Ultimate's locales were designed from the start to incorporate verticality, so the hunter's new abilities could be used to their full potential. So all these mechanics and new animations are going to be used throughout the entire game. In regards to mounting, it's advantageous to the player and extremely cool to pull off, so it would and did see heavy use. And everything was carried over to Monster Hunter Generations. Mounting and the hunter's new movement options were present in this game. But Generations also expanded the combat further with the hunting styles. They also added hunter arts, which were special attacks that needed to be charged up over time. What kind of resources were needed to implement this? Well, they needed to design unique hunter arts that could be used generally, as well as per weapon. They needed to animate the aerial vault, the adept evade, the valor sheath, the alchemy barrel and all related attacks, as well as code how they work. This was definitely a lot of effort, but it did not involve them reanimating every single existing attack. Instead, the developers just added on to what already existed in Monster Hunter 4. Monster Hunter World practically had to remake everything from scratch, but they were still able to take advantage of referencing the hunter arts and style attacks for some of the new additions the weapon received, such as the hammer's Big Bang, the longsword's counters, or the sword and shield's perfect rush. Sliding was something new they added on top of that to enhance traversal and give players new mounting opportunities. When they added the clutch claw in Iceborne, they had to code in special attacks and combos for each weapon, as well as clagger animations for every monster type. It wasn't a good mechanic, but all they had to do was build off what already existed. And Monster Hunter Rise does the same. The wire bugs build upon the hunter's mobility, and the various switch skills and silkbind attacks are either new, or reuse attacks from Generations and Iceborne, with the base movesets copied over from World. The point I'm making here is that all these mechanics they added throughout the series were simple additions, but cleverly designed to affect the whole game, and change the way you approach combat. Something like hunting styles and arts probably took a substantial amount of work, but not only was it building upon the foundation of the land-based combat, not only did it change the entire way you approach fights, and give the game a really unique identity with tons of customization and replayability, but it also laid down its own foundation for World and Rise to take advantage of. The time and effort invested in developing these systems for all these games is not as high as it needs to be, because they're always building upon what already exists, making the process easier, and they have substantial effects on the entire game, sometimes awful, sometimes amazing. Now let's look back at underwater combat. They made this huge system, coded in and animated new movement, almost every attack from the weapons, the oxygen meter, the underwater monsters, everything, for a mechanic that is present for roughly 20% of the entire game, even less in 3 Ultimate. And Monster Hunter Tri suffered for this. Do you think it's a coincidence that we went from 59 monsters in Freedom Unite and 12 weapon types down to 18 monsters and 7 weapon types in the very next game? It's because a significant amount of time and resources went into developing underwater combat, and let's be real, it was a bit of wasted potential, wasn't it? Portable Third was able to bring back the weapon types, give them new revamps, and add many different monsters that weren't in Tri, and this game didn't have underwater combat, instead sticking to a tried and tested system of gameplay. Let's say they're going to bring in underwater combat to Monster Hunter 6. They'd have to do it all again, recreate the underwater zones, code in the new movement, and animate every single attack. Which would be much harder now, because weapons are more complicated and there are more of them than before. Chargeblade and Insect Glaive now need entirely new revamps from scratch. Creating cool and unique monsters is hard enough, but now they have to make monsters with entirely other underwater movesets. Magnamalo is a monster with at least 16 unique attacks. If they make an underwater capable flagship for the next game, they now have to distribute attacks between both planes of combat. Not just for them, but other underwater monsters too. This would take such an amount of work that will detrimentally affect the rest of the game. It's entirely possible that we get less monsters, less weapon types, or even just less actual new stuff in general, just like Monster Hunter Tri, all for a mechanic that isn't even a huge part of the game. It was a hugely inefficient use of resources compared to every other mechanic in future games. I've been saying this a lot, that underwater combat was not a huge part of Tri and 3 Ultimate, and that's why it was a massive waste of resources. So you might be thinking, could this not be fixed by having underwater play a bigger role? First of all, no, underwater is straight up a different style of gameplay, so it will never affect the entire game the same way Verticality or the Wirebug does. Because even if it returns, the game it's in will still be very much land based. But okay, let's say things are different. What if the water zones were present in all the maps, and at least half the monsters in the game were underwater capable? Surely recreating this gameplay mechanic would now be worthwhile, since more of the experience would focus on it, right? This leads to another issue. Underwater combat was not universally liked, or loved. It was hated by many people and still is. When Monster Hunter 4 enhanced the Hunter's moveset, it was praised heavily as a huge step forward for the series. It made the gameplay much more fluid, and in a way that made the older games a bit hard to go back to, and because it was so well received, they kept incorporating Verticality into future games. Now if you remember, people were very mixed on underwater combat, and many were quite frankly overjoyed at its removal. It was a very polarizing mechanic that might have been received even worse if it was a bigger part of the game. I liken it to Monster Hunter Rise's rampages. I'm going to be honest, I don't know a single person who actually loves these things. I know people who like them, and plenty who are indifferent like me. But most absolutely hated them, including everyone I personally know who played Rise, even the newcomers. But rampages are a tiny part of Rise. You only ever have to do 2 in the entire game, and they can be otherwise ignored. If the game required more of them to be played, they'd probably be even more hated, but they were incorporated into the game in such a way that they're almost fully optional, and could easily be cut for Sunbreak. Underwater combat was a bigger part of its respective game, but still pretty small and still very disliked. From what I've seen, a lot of the people who want underwater combat back are people who weren't fans of it in Tri or 3 Ultimate. They simply believe it has a lot of potential, and that Capcom could maybe make it good this time. But there's zero guarantee of that. These are the same guys who made the Clutch Claw after all. It could easily end up being just as flawed or even worse. And if they decide to make it a big part of the game, that could lead to a very mixed or even terrible reception. And if they try and make it a small part of the overall experience, then it's just a waste of time and resources. Is it really worth taking that risk, investing all that time and effort into a gameplay mechanic that is completely different to the standard Monster Hunter combat, that would take resources that could be invested into other things in the game, all for something that wasn't even well liked to begin with, when instead they could do what they have been doing for the past decade, focusing on the tried and tested vertical land-based combat. The biggest, most persistent criticism of 4's approach was that the map design sometimes made it annoying to actually fight the monsters, and that mounting was a bit too overpowered. Generations, the very next entry in the series, fixed both issues, made it harder to mount monsters, and its new maps were a lot flatter while still having vertical elements. They continue to expand this popular fun mechanic while introducing and experimenting with new ones, making for some genuinely great games. And they could continue doing that, instead of taking a huge risk with a gameplay mechanic from over a decade ago. The fact of the matter is that every single problem related to underwater combat 11 years ago still exists now. That's the bulk of my first issue. Multiple reasons combined as to why I do not want underwater combat to make a return. So now you might be thinking, okay, let's say they managed to implement it successfully. It doesn't cause any development issues, all weapon types are present with underwater movesets, and there's a nice healthy roster of monsters. What if they improved it? Well, here's my second and probably only other issue. I don't think underwater combat is good. I don't think it's a good idea, and I don't think that as a gameplay mechanic it has much potential. If there was any, Triad and 3 Ultimate failed to properly show us. It shouldn't return because it's bad. Okay, let me elaborate on that a bit. The whole draw of underwater combat, the whole concept behind it, was that the hunter will get to move around in a fully 3D vertical and horizontal space. It's an alternate style of gameplay that provides a different experience. So what exactly does fighting in a 3D space do for the overall experience? Not much if you ask me. When fighting monsters like Royal Ludroth, Plesioth or Lagiacrus, there's not a single thing the developers make them do that really takes advantage of being in a 3D space. Pretty much all of their attacks are their basic land projectiles, charges and tail flicks. Monsters like Diamoralis don't even do anything differently underwater. The one monster that actually felt unique because of underwater combat was Gobul. His abilities related to being an anglerfish, his burrowing, as well as his ambushes make him quite interesting to fight down there. The thing is though, Nibblesnuff does the exact same thing above land. Gobul has one attack, just one, where it feels like it could not be replicated above land, and that is his suction attack, where he burrows up from the ground and tries to suck you in from below. It works well because you're directly above him and have to use the 3D space to maneuver around him and get away, and it wouldn't work as well on land. But it's the only underwater attack I can think of that uses the 3D space effectively. It's also worth mentioning that Gobul has never returned outside of water combat games, so it seems the developers agree with me there. In my History of Lagiacrus video, I state that underwater combat was what made him interesting, and without it he was not worth bringing back, being identical to a Royal Ludroth. But the truth is, underwater combat only made Lagiacrus interesting by dramatically increasing his speed and heavily reducing ours. Not just his speed, they also gave him new movement options. Lagiacrus and Royal Ludroth like to swim around you, and it helps them reposition for other attacks. They can't do this on land, and it's why they're harder underwater. But other Leviathans can do it. Mizutsune frequently repositions himself and jumps around to try and throw you off and get a better shot at you. Armadron as well. Jyuratodus does it by running around when he's out of the water. It looks goofy, but it works. And is there really anything stopping them from giving this to Lagiacrus and making him interesting again? Earlier in the video, I praised how underwater combat lets you access monster parts you wouldn't normally be able to hit, such as Lagiacrus's back spikes or Diamoralis' weak points. But to be honest, underwater combat is not even needed for this. Knocking down the monster naturally grants you access to them anyway, and recent games that have tools like the wire bugs or the hunter arts to reach them too. Monsters like Duramboros have their weak points high on their back, so you can't normally hit it unless you knock him down, and he has a higher chance of being knocked down while performing his most dangerous attacks, which makes for a really fun dynamic. It shows that there's always a better, more clever way of doing these kinds of things. Let's be real, the only thing the mechanic really affected at the end of the day was how we play, limiting our movement options, reducing our speed and attacks. The hunters are the ones most affected by underwater combat. Remember how I mentioned the dynamic of monsters like Gormagala and Malzeno entering new states that change the fight and force you to adapt? What makes those mechanics great is that they're the ones who change and become more dangerous. We just have to use our existing tools more effectively to take them down and knock them out. When underwater, the monster changes, yes, but so do we. We don't just have to adapt to a harder version of the monster, but we now have what is fundamentally a different and worse moveset to do it with. Adapting becomes even harder because we have to struggle and quickly come to grips with these new controls, and it makes the experience extremely unfun. Even monsters that fly execute this dynamic better than underwater monsters. When Rathalos or Kushala Daora or Rathian go airborne, we now have to avoid a new set of attacks or figure out how to use our tools to bring them down, and like Gormagala, they change the fight instantly. Underwater fights have an extremely slow transition, make the monster harder, but leave us with a worse set of tools to try and adapt to a very different style of gameplay. Another issue is that, with the exception of Gobul, we can't force the monsters out of the water the same way we can knock out Zinogre, Magnamalo or Gormagala, or knock flying monsters out of the sky. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Alternatively, it's cool that the monster controls the pace of the fight like this, but the fact that we're at such a huge disadvantage with no way to rectify it doesn't motivate you to fight harder. It just makes you want to run the clock and wait till they go back on land. I don't have much faith they would actually be able to make underwater combat good for a future game. because designing fully three-dimensional combat for a game as complex as Monster Hunter is no easy task. Making it good is even harder, and making it superior to land combat is, in my opinion, impossible. Underwater combat should not return to Monster Hunter, ever. It's an incredibly inefficient use of time and resources that could instead be used to develop actually good gameplay mechanics seen in recent Monster Hunter games. Those mechanics are things that not only didn't take as much time to create, but affected the entire game in positive ways, and allowed future entries to build upon them. Underwater combat affected less than a quarter of both games it was present in, despite taking way more effort to implement. So I don't want underwater combat back, and more importantly, I do not think the developers will ever add it in the foreseeable future. Even if it was well liked by everyone, which it 100% was not, it takes such an absurd amount of resources and requires a complete revamp of so many different mechanics that it's just not efficient to ever do again. Focus on land verticality and expand the hunter's moveset there instead. So that's my stance on the topic. I don't want it back, despite any potential it might have. However, there is still a way to incorporate more water into Monster Hunter. Not necessarily full underwater combat, but something similar. World and Rise have taken steps already, and there is a genuine potential to expand upon it. It wouldn't take nearly as much time and effort to implement as full underwater, but still provide a lot of fun possibilities. The key to it all is Jyuratodus. Jyuratodus is one of the earlier monsters you can encounter in Monster Hunter World. He is a pissing wyvern who spits mud and swims around in the water. He lives only in the Wildspire Waste, a desert crossed canyon style locale, and he can only move around in 3 areas that are slightly submerged in water. World has many areas throughout the game that are like this, and you have to wade through. You still have access to your entire movement options and attacks, you're just a bit slower, and this can be offset entirely by using Maya Walker jewels. Jyuratodus has 2 movement forms, so to speak. When he's submerged, he will swim around, try to hip check you, and ambush you from below. If you deal enough damage, he will be forced to stand up, exposing his legs, which are a big weak point. But when he's standing up, his way of attacking changes. He also returned for Monster Hunter Rise, with an enhanced moveset. Shallow water also returns, but it doesn't slow you down and isn't as deep, but it doesn't stop monsters like Jyuratodus from swimming around. He effectively has 2 modes, one for when he's submerged in water, and one where he stands up. He is the only monster to make use of this water in World, but he shows a lot of potential. Perhaps you see where I'm going with this. Like I have pointed out many times in this video, the developers are constantly building upon old systems and refining them. This shallow water was barely used in World and was widely used in Rise, but more stripped down. But what if they were to be brought back and utilised a bit more? Take Lagiacrus. What made him hard underwater is that we were slow while he had full control of his movement. That dynamic disappears on land. But what if there was a compromise with this shallow water? Give Lagiacrus full speed, have him move swiftly while we wade around, and it could be a great challenge. There's also no reason Leviathans like Armadron, Somnicant could be revamped to better make use of the water too. Lagiacrus has a technical issue where his body adapting to land takes up way too much processing power, and the result of this is that he hasn't been added to recent games. If this issue can't be fixed, having him live in partially submerged zones could be an idea worth exploring, as his body wouldn't have to make contact with the ground, and the water would disguise that fact. Gobul is a monster that on paper, and kind of in practice, feels like he can't return without underwater combat. But something I wasn't aware of when writing this video was that in 3 Ultimate's G rank he starts in Area 1 of the Flooded Forest, which is a zone without any underwater segments. Gobul is forced to fight on land without being exhausted, and he actually displays strategies I didn't know he was capable of. He frequently submerges himself underwater and ambushes you from below with his lantern and spike attacks. He still feels very similar to Nibblesnuff, but he was actually formidable here, and I honestly think they could both coexist in the same game, one Leviathan to live in the desert, with another living in the forest. Gobul could definitely have been on Rise too with a moveset like this, because he fights very similarly to Jyuratodus. He would be perfect with World's submerged zones too. This, in my opinion, is the only way to go if you want some kind of water combat back. All existing attack animations are reused, which cuts down on development time massively. The real challenge would be enhancing water capable monsters so that they're stronger in water areas. A lot of thought would have to go into it, since copying the Jyuratodus mechanic for every amphibious monster might be a bit difficult and maybe even detrimental to them. The way I would hope they would do it is like how in Rise, every single locale except the sandy plains has these huge bodies of water. If a future game dedicated a third or so of the total map to these submerged zones, water combat could be worthwhile. I would also want Maya Walker jewels to become level 2 decorations. This way negating the added difficulty is a bit harder, but still possible for anyone who wants to do it. The issue with this approach is that the 360-degree multi-dimensional combat aspect of the original would not be present for us, only the monster. But as we have established, that is where most of the original problems lied, so maybe this approach is for the best. I think it's the best way forward for implementing water combat, and I don't see any reason trying to bring back the 3 Ultimate version. Some of you guys might not know this, but I've had a Patreon for a while now. If you donate, you'll be able to see videos a few days in advance. My current patrons, for instance, saw this video earlier this week, and if you donate, you'll get to see future videos earlier than everyone else too. You also get to support me, which I'd also really appreciate. I want to do a lot more with this channel, and I have big plans for even bigger videos in the future, and having more support would make it a lot easier. Even if you can't directly donate, simply just watching the video, sharing it with your friends, as well as liking and commenting can also really go a long way, and it would be a massive help. You don't get credited at the end of videos like you would if you were a patron, but it's still appreciated by me all the same. So yeah, please donate to my Patreon. Underwater combat was introduced as a brand new gameplay mechanic in Monster Hunter Tri. It was not present in Portable 3rd, but returned for 3 Ultimate, where it made its last appearance. At the time of its removal, it had a very mixed reception, but over the years it would seem that many people want to see it return, as they believe it has a lot of potential and could end up being something great in the next game. I, however, disagree with this. It would take a huge amount of resources just to implement, resources that could be used to make the rest of the game shine. It wasn't a huge part of Monster Hunter Tri, but despite this the game had to cut entire weapon types and only had 18 monsters, which to be honest made it somewhat of a wasted effort. I don't think underwater combat is particularly good either. Once the novelty wears off, you come to realise that ironically there really isn't much depth to this mechanic. Monsters fight almost the exact same way they do on land, nothing is really that different on their end, it's us who are affected, in almost entirely negative ways. The combat is just clunkier, the controls are awful, and there's no depth perception. Even if they managed to make it good in a new game, it would never be as fun as the land-based combat. The developers could either invest a huge amount of time and resources trying to make a game mechanic from 13 years ago actually good, or they could instead focus on what already works, their current land-based combat system, enhanced with verticality since the release of Monster Hunter 4. That being said, there could be a way for them to implement some kind of water combat to really enhance amphibious monsters throughout the series. By expanding on the shallow water mechanic seen in Wild and Rise, they could compromise a little, by having monsters swim around here like with the Jyuratodus. Unlike underwater, I do genuinely believe there's potential here, and they could make it work. I would be completely fine with water combat coming back like this. But as for the main question of this video, should underwater combat return to Monster Hunter? For me, the answer is a hard no. Thank you for watching this video. It's been in the works for a very long time. I've been wanting to make an underwater video since the Forgotten Monsters, but it's never really worked out. It was supposed to be this set of videos. The first would be the Forgotten Monsters, where I talk about monsters that haven't been in a series for a long time, some of them because there's no underwater combat. Part 2 would be the Lagiacrus video. This was going to be part evolution, part just general Monster Hunter, where I discussed whether or not Lagiacrus needed underwater combat or not. I scrapped it because I decided that at the time I had nothing unique to say on Lagiacrus, and by extension underwater combat. Fast forward to some time ago, I was planning future evolution videos. Normally I use Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate to represent monsters from Tri, because 9 times out of 10 they're identical in both games. But Barioth actually has substantial differences in Tri that did not carry over to Portable 3rd, nor 3 Ultimate. And so I decided that I needed to play Tri in order to properly record and note them down. When doing so, I was able to properly once again experience underwater combat and Lagiacrus, and I realised that I do have something to say about them. The results are these videos. This one here is my longest one ever. It was tough to make, but honestly I'm really glad I made it. The evolution videos are very cool, people like them and I like them too. but I also do miss the stuff I used to make, where I will just talk about the game itself, so it's good to finally be at it again. I still have plenty of ideas for other stuff too. Do you guys disagree with me? Do you think underwater combat would actually be a great addition and be worth bringing back? Or do you agree with me and think that it's not really worth it and that it wasn't any good to begin with? Let me know what you think. Remember to like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, donate to me on Patreon, and have a good day.